In the golden city of Los Angeles, under skies forever painted in cinematic sunsets, there walks a man who once stood amid the blinding dazzle of Hollywood, but never let it blind him. His name is Tom Skerritt, and though his face is recognizably carved into some of the most iconic films of the 20th century, Alien, Top Gun, A River Runs Through It, his soul has always stood apart from the machine that fed on fame. While others raised their voices or crafted carefully curated lives for the public eye, Skerritt chose something far more radical: silence. Stillness. The artistry of stepping back. But this isn't a tale of a recluse. It's about a man who looked the American dream square in the eye and quietly asked it not to devour him. Tom was not born among stars but under a Midwestern sky, in Detroit, Michigan, in the hard winter of 1933. The Great Depression loomed like an invisible second parent in every family's home. Wars were still being fought, cities were still being built, and dreams were more survival than salvation. Yet even then, there was a certain way that Tom observed the world, quietly, attentively, that set him apart. He was the kind of boy who would sit alone by the river while the other kids threw punches or played games, watching the water carry twigs and lost feathers downstream. He noticed things others missed: the way light passed through a glass of water, how the world seemed to hush an instant before it snowed. His father was a business executive, stern and unbending, a typical man of his era. His mother, gentle but worn out from years of sacrifice. Conversation at the dinner table was sparse, but in place of noise there was discipline, order, and that silence which Tom would one day not only grow accustomed to, but seek. As he came of age, the world seemed to change itself more quickly than any one person could follow. The Second World War ended, television began groping for dominance, jazz gave way to rock and roll, and young Americans were told they could be anything, if only they screamed loudly enough. But Tom never screamed. He listened. Always. His love for storytelling came like smoke, slowly drifting into his life during his time at college. First at Wayne State, then later at UCLA, where he refined an appreciation for literature, for crisp dialogue, for the art of what wasn't said. He first flirted with the idea of being a writer, fueled more by the rhythm of well-constructed prose than the flash of red carpets. But the industry had other plans. That unique, chiseled face, the kind that spoke volumes even in silence, soon found its way before the camera. In 1962, Tom made his film debut in War Hunt, a quiet, character-driven war film far from the bombast of blockbusters. It was a modest role, nested within a modest production. But it put him on the map, or at least, in the margins. Over the next decade, as the machinery of Hollywood revved into high gear, Tom remained a working actor, reliable, respected, rarely in the center of the shot. Never the loudest, the wildest, or the most scandalous. And that was precisely his design. Because here's the thing about Hollywood, it's not just a place, it's a hum, a perpetual buzz of ambition and illusion. Many arrive and wish only to be seen. Others scream just to be heard. But Tom Skerritt never needed the noise. He needed the truth. And the truth lives not in the spotlight, where nothing can hide, but in the shadows, where people are their most unguarded. It's that subtle layer he always brought to his roles, men who seemed solid but were roiling beneath the surface. Whether he was playing the sympathetic sheriff in MASH, the stern but compassionate viper in Top Gun, or the pragmatic captain in Ridley Scott's Alien, there was more going on behind the eyes than most audiences could name. You could almost feel it, this man knew something the rest of us had forgotten. But it didn't mean Tom didn't struggle. Fame is a seducer, it whispers with honeyed voice, convincing you that being adored is the same as being loved. There were moments when the pull of celebrity dangled its rewards in front of him, the larger trailers, the bigger contracts, the limitless attention. And yet, time and again, he turned inward. Not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. Because Tom's greatest battle was never with the industry. It was with himself, with what kind of man he wanted to be. In a world that worships noise, he carved a life through stillness. When agents advised him to be more aggressive, more present, more brandyable, he simply smiled and chose another script that felt right, not one that screamed money. When tabloids demanded access, he closed the door, poured himself a glass of wine in his quietly nestled home in the Pacific Northwest, and watched the trees instead. Actors typically chase roles to be seen. Tom gravitated toward them to understand something deeply human: fear, dignity, loneliness. It's almost as if the camera only caught what overflowed from him, not what he intended to perform. And perhaps that's the key: Tom Skerritt didn't act. He revealed. He spent decades building not a brand, but a legacy, one far less noisy but infinitely more enduring. Those who knew him personally speak not of parties or premieres, but of late-night conversations, of moments where he listened intently as if words were rare birds that might fly away if spoken too quickly. He mentored many quietly, never with the dramatic flourish of a master actor offering his wisdom, but with the humility of a man who knew silence taught more than speeches. Yet despite his refusal to play the fame game, Hollywood never managed to forget him. Even in the 2000s and 2010s, his name still resonated like a low, steady drumbeat beneath the chaotic rhythms of celebrity. Directors still sought him out, not because he was the most bankable, but because he never lied on screen. Because in a town of masks, his honesty was almost holy. And so, while others burned brightly and fast, only to fizzle under the weight of ego or addiction, Tom Skerritt remained. Not distant. Just deliberate. A quiet force among crashing waves. A man who lived his art not by saturating the world with his image, but by curating each moment like a gallery piece, composed, true, and alive. But this story is far from over. Because there comes a time, even for the quiet ones, when the silence must break. When a man who spent his life avoiding the spotlight steps forward, not to claim applause, but to share why he walked in the shadows all along. By the late 1970s, Los Angeles was humming like an overworked machine. The city, bloated with dreams and bathed in smog, had become a garden of lights, where every streetlight reflected off tinted limousine windows and hopes ran red in stained carpet beneath hurried feet. Hollywood, by then, had developed a hunger for excess, for larger-than-life personalities, for chaotic brilliance, for those ecstatic collapses that looked so good on camera. It wasn't enough to be talented anymore. You had to shine, even if burning meant the inevitable fall. In the middle of this feverish crescendo of ego and artistry walked Tom Skerritt, quiet as ever, calm as a lake untouched by wind. While the industry around him demanded transformation, reinvention, loudness, he remained stunningly unchanged, like the central root of a tree that refuses to sway even as its canopy thrashes in the wind. This was the world Skerritt moved through when Ridley Scott came calling with an Alien. Alien, 1979, wasn't just another science fiction film. It was a psychological opera set in space, with silence as one of its most terrifying instruments. The role of Captain Dallas was not built for flashy charisma. In fact, it required someone who could communicate volumes with stillness, someone who could feel commanding without declaiming, who could fully inhabit fear without surrendering to it. That, in a way, was Skerritt's spiritual fingerprint. When Tom first read the script, it wasn't the alien that disturbed him, it was the voice hidden between the lines. This was a tale not of monsters in space but of isolation, of leadership under pressure, of humans folding under unseen forces. He knew these truths on a cellular level. That deep, quiet nightmare of being surrounded and still entirely alone. He took the role, not because it was strategic, but because it told the truth. During production, while younger actors paced and tensions flared under a claustrophobic set, Tom remained grounded. He treated the fragile balance of fiction and fear with something akin to reverence. His performance as Captain Dallas was composed, magnetic, respectful. When he whispered, the audience leaned forward. He didn't have to become anyone else. He only had to allow his natural precision, the careful cadence, the heavy silences between thoughts, to carry the story. The movie exploded into a global phenomenon. Films rarely become cultural touchstones and critical darlings in the same breath, but Alien did just that. In the glittering storm that followed, the cast was hurled into the orbit of public fascination. Reporters called. Award shows reached out. Studios began reworking their slates, eager to feature the next generation of stars. Sigourney Weaver emerged as a powerful icon. That was expected. But so did Tom. Offers poured in. Always polite but often pulsing with a capitalistic urgency. Let's build on your image. We'll get your name on everything. You're the next Gene Hackman. Tom's agent begged him to play along. You've got a window, Tom, he said, and the spotlight's right there. All you gotta do is step into it. But he didn't. Instead, he disappeared to Seattle. At the very peak of what should have been his stardom's eruption, he turned towards the mountains and disappeared behind evergreens and ocean fog. He'd tasted the beginning of the roaring feast, and it didn't satisfy his hunger, it deepened his thirst for solitude. Friends and journalists were baffled. Who, in their right mind, walks away when the gates of Olympus open wide? But the irony was, and always had been, that Tom had never truly felt those gates. He wasn't like the others. He hadn't come to Hollywood to be adored. He came to participate in crafting something real. And Hollywood, increasingly, wasn't built for that. In Seattle, the days let him breathe again. He took up gardening, walked the trails with a camera slung across his shoulder, and made time for mail, for long handwritten letters to friends. He became the man who went to small-town theaters and watched young actors perform. He coached some. He helped others build communities around storytelling instead of ego. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, a different kind of storm paused only to devour another next big thing. But the work never stopped, for either of them. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Tom continued to act, but now on his terms. There was Bob and A River Runs Through It, Emmett and Picket Fences, and dozens of roles that, when looked at together, formed a mosaic of quiet husbands, complicated fathers, small-town leaders, and uncertain men. He didn't bend toward what was popular. He played men haunted by things they couldn't fix, and did so with an honesty so transparent it stayed in the marrow of anyone who watched. Because by then, Tom Skerritt wielded silence like a sword. It wasn't just modesty. It was wisdom. Looking back now, it's clear, Skerritt was one of the few film artists who realized that the most valuable currency in acting, and in life, was presence, not pretense. While others projected, he embodied. While others performed, he listened. His approach defied the increasingly frenetic pace of Hollywood's new millennium, where social media invited every actor to play the role of themselves, constantly, hungrily, endlessly. Tom skipped that stage entirely, never needed validation from strangers to confirm what he'd already rooted inside himself. There's one story recounted often among lesser-known actors, a kind of Skerritt parable. In it, a young man, fresh from acting school, found himself seated next to Tom Skerritt at a sparse outdoor cafe in Seattle after a community theater performance. They exchanged pleasantries, and the younger man confessed he was pursuing acting but struggling to feel authentic in his work. Tom stirred his coffee slowly and said only this: "You don't have to be loud to be heard. But you do need to tell the truth." Then he smiled, quietly paid the bill for both of them, and walked off without leaving a card or a name. That young actor still tells the story. To him, it was a glimpse behind the veil, a rare encounter with someone who had seen it all, and chosen not to let it consume him. Tom's quietness had become mythic. Now in the twilight of his career, Tom Skerritt stands not as a legend in league with household names, but as something rarer, a man who aged gracefully in an industry that worships youth like a fleeting god. He continues, even now, to write poems, to paint, a different kind of storytelling, one without contracts or reviews. And through it all, he remains a question mark in a world of exclamation points. But the story still waits, for its reckoning point, for the moment when silence itself becomes the headline. Because Tom Skerritt will break his quiet in the most unexpected way. The Pacific Northwest has a hum of its own. It's not the scream of traffic or the artificial energy of billboards. It's softer, it's the rustle of tall pines in the wind, the low thrum of ferries crossing to small, wooded islands, the whisper of morning fog rolling in from the sound. For Tom Skerritt, Seattle had become more than a retreat. It was a palette of texture and tone where nothing shouted but everything resonated. It was here that he watched himself grow older, not with the dread of someone watching their fame recede, but with the wonder of an artist watching life reveal its deeper colors. But even in silence, the heart stirs. Tom had never turned completely away from storytelling. In his quiet corner of the world, he had been planting seeds, not of ambition, but of meaning. Over the years, he quietly co-founded Hayo Media, a digital media company rooted in Seattle. He mentored emerging filmmakers not in how to stand out, but in how to stand true. He saw the tools of storytelling changing: smaller screens, faster content, weakened attention, but rather than resist them with nostalgia, he embraced them with intention. If you can't slow the world, he believed, at least fill its rush with something honest. And there was something else awakening inside him. It had to do with memory, the way time had folded onto itself, the way moments from the past kept rising unbidden in the quiet of his later years. One evening, while sitting beside the roaring fireplace in his lakeside home, Tom turned to his wife and said, "It matters what we leave behind, but it matters more that we leave the right things." She looked at him, puzzled. "Are you talking about your films?" He smiled softly. "No. I'm talking about my voice." For all the years he had embodied other men, recited other words, and disappeared into roles, Tom realized something was still unsaid: his story. And not the polished, red carpet version. The real one. The version that talked about fear. About fatherhood. About war and regret. About the emptiness success can't fill. The story of a man who didn't run from fame but from the parts of himself it tempted most. And so, at age 87, the man best known for his expressive silences decided to speak. But not through talk shows or a tell-all memoir. That wasn't his language. Instead, he wrote quietly, page after page, in longhand, fueled by coffee, jazz, the quiet coo of doves outside his study window. He wrote small essays at first, portraits of people in his life, the real heroes, the quiet saints. Then came poems. Short, contemplative screenings of the soul. Memories unfolded with cautious grace: the fear of being drafted during Korea, the first time a stage light blinded him, the night his father died and left more silence behind than most men leave memories. It became clear to those around him that this wasn't just an old actor reminiscing. This was a man processing, finally giving weight to things he had kept tucked behind a stoic brow and a knowing smile. His entire life had been about restraint, holding back just enough, listening before reacting. But now, in these quiet writings, he let go. Eventually, those close to him encouraged compiling these pieces. Not as a performance, but as a legacy. And so began the quiet development of The Weight of Quiet, a book that would be part memoir, part meditation, a vessel to carry the story of the man who had always lingered in the frame, just enough to ground a scene, never enough to steal it. Still, Skerritt wrestled with the idea of its release. The last thing he wanted was to create the kind of noise he'd avoided all his life. He debated shelving it entirely after months of work. But then came the night that changed his resolve. He was invited to a small film festival not far from home, the kind hosted in independent cinemas with creaky floors and handmade programs stapled by volunteers. They were screening A River Runs Through It, and afterwards, hosting a panel on fatherhood in film. Tom hadn't expected much. Maybe a dozen people. Maybe a question or two. But the theater was full. Not just with fans, but with sons and fathers, with young women who came to confess that his portrayal of fathers and mentors had helped them grieve men just like him. When he stepped to the mic, modestly, hesitantly, something profound happened. The room fell silent before he even spoke. That kind of silence you feel in your bones. Then someone asked, How did you deliver so many powerful roles without ever making them about you? Tom paused, and smiled. Because I never thought they were. He looked up, his voice steady but soft. Every character I ever played, I tried to listen to them first. Let them reveal themselves instead of me shaping them. Like people in life. Most folks just need to be heard. That night, his book wasn't just something he could publish. It became something he had to share. A few months later, a small literary press announced its publication. No frills, no TV deals, no marketing blitz. Just one man, revealing piece by piece what he had quietly carried for decades. The weight of quiet surprised many. Not because it was sensational, but because it was still. It didn't justify his choices. It didn't frame his silence as rebellion or romanticize retreat. Instead, it opened a careful window into how choosing not to engage in the frenzy gave him space to become fully himself. Where others came to Hollywood searching for identity, Scarrett found it by not letting Hollywood take his. The memoir explored the culture of perpetual noise, of being taught from a young age to be impressive rather than to be real. It challenged the assumption that success is always loud. That visibility equals value. Instead, it offered what Scarrett embodied all along, the quiet dignity of being present without having to dominate the room. In one chapter, titled The Actor Who Wasn't Acting, he wrote, "I never stepped on a stage to be loved. I stepped there because I loved what stillness could do. Because silence, wielded with grace, is a force. And being unseen never meant I wasn't there. Sometimes the deepest roots grow in the dark, and that's why the tree stands through storms." The book went on to become something rare, a word-of-mouth feast in a literary world filled with shouts. It reached therapists who handed it to grieving patients. Artists in creative droughts pinned its quotes to their studio walls. Men who hadn't cried in years read it in silence and let tears come unannounced. Tom Scarrett, the silent presence in a sea of spectacle, had finally spoken. And the world, once too noisy to truly hear him, now listened with reverent quiet. And yet, he never sought the acknowledgement for it. No bookstore tour. No hour-long CNN interviews. Just another walk by the water's edge. Another evening with jazz humming low in the background. Another long night of writing, reflecting, listening. Because for Scarrett, fame was never the fire. The flame had always come from choices made in silence, the kind that don't bask in attention but burn low and true in the beating core of a well-lived life. But a final act still awaits him, a moment so unexpected, so full circle, that even the man who planned nothing couldn't have anticipated it. It wasn't a grand stage. In fact, it hardly looked like a stage at all. Just a makeshift wooden platform under a canopy of red maples, on the grounds of a theater tucked deep in rural Oregon. No velvet curtains, no rows of golden seats. The audience sat on folding chairs, mugs of warm cider in their hands, their coats sipped against the evening chill. The world, outside this small pocket of the Pacific Northwest, was moving fast, scrolling endlessly, trading substance for speed. But here, everything slowed. Tom Scarrett stood at the edge of that platform. 88 years old, shoulders slightly stooped but eyes impossibly alive, he held a crumpled set of pages in one hand and lifted his gaze toward the crowd. They weren't strangers. They were creatives, students, teachers, neighbors. Many had taken his workshops over the years. Others had only known him as the quiet man who sits in the back row of plays and nods too carefully not to be someone. That evening wasn't planned as a final act. That was never Scarrett's style. But something in the air said goodbye before he ever spoke. The program had simply read. An evening of story with Tom Scarrett. And for the first time in the decade since he'd turned away from cameras and chaos, he let the story begin, not through another character, not through metaphor or silence, but as himself. "I've always believed," he began, voice gravelly but unshaken, "that the loudest truths are whispered. And tonight, I suppose, I'm going to whisper a little of my own." The crowd hushed, collectively leaning forward. Over the next hour, he spoke not to an audience but to people, gently, like someone opening an old drawer and carefully setting out memories one by one. He didn't dramatize. He didn't glorify. He simply told the truth. About the role he was offered and turned down that would have shot him into superstardom, and why he didn't feel ready to lose himself to millions. About watching friends implode under the pressure of being known by everyone and understood by no one. About the letters he wrote to his children each time he left for filming, not signing them as Tom the actor, but as Dad, who might not know everything, but loves you without needing to. And in a particularly vulnerable moment, he admitted something few had ever heard. When I left Los Angeles, he said, holding the mic like something sacred, I wasn't just walking away from the fame. I was walking away from myself, or the parts of me I was afraid would fall in love with the noise. I had to find the man behind the actor. There were no tears for attention. But a deep, raw shimmer of emotion coated every sentence. And there, in that gentle space between spotlight and shadow, the crowd didn't just hear his words, they felt their own truths, pulled out from whatever quiet corners they'd buried them in. In the final 10 minutes, he read a piece from his book, The Weight of Quiet. His voice shook just once. I used to think silence was something that came after the noise, but now I believe it's what holds everything together. Like glue. Like gravity. Like love you never have to prove. When the applause came, it wasn't raucous. It was warm, reverent. The kind of gratitude clapped into cold palms by people who didn't see a legend up there, but a fellow soul who had carried the invisible weight for all of them. And then, almost as if nothing had changed, Tom stepped off the makeshift stage and quietly folded his notes. He didn't linger in the back for praise. He didn't hold court. He hugged some friends, smiled at the students, and exited out the side gate into the deepening evening. Some believed it would be his last public appearance. And in many ways, it was, as the man they had come to see. But what came after was more profound than any stage farewell. In the months that followed, the story began to radiate outward. Little clips from that evening's talk were uploaded by audience members. One video, just him saying, "You don't have to be loud to be heard," went modestly viral, shared by introverts, teachers, artists, quiet survivors of loud pains. The book, previously a literary niche, was suddenly being quoted in mental health forums, screenwriting seminars, even some theology classrooms. Because Tom's stillness had finally found the exact time the world was ready to receive it. And then came something he hadn't expected, a letter. Delivered in stiff linen envelope, no stamp. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note from a young woman in her early 20s. I just want you to know that your book saved my life. I was drowning under pressure, to be seen, to be liked, to succeed loudly. Everything was performative. And then I read your words and realized, some lives aren't meant to scream. Some lives heal others just by whispering. Thank you for whispering. He read that letter while sitting on his porch, his dog curled at his feet. The sky hung heavy with incoming rain. When the first drop hit the page, he didn't lift it to cover. He let the smudge happen. It felt right. Proof that something real had touched the moment. Tom showed the letter to no one. But 2 weeks later, he made a decision that surprised even those closest to him. He agreed to take a role. Not in a feature film. Not in a biopic. But in a small, deeply personal indie drama titled Stillwater Nights, written by one of his former ments. The film centered on an aging lighthouse keeper plagued by memories, retreating from a past that keeps knocking in waves. It wasn't a flashy script. But it was full of breath. Of restraint. Of things unsaid. They filmed it in 9 weeks. Bare bones production. Low budget. No studio interference. And when the first cuts came through, and Tom watched himself on screen at nearly 90, face aged with time but still strong, he didn't flinch. Because it wasn't about being seen. It was about capturing what lasts. That quiet sorrow. That dignified presence. That unspoken permission to be, just as you are. The movie, once finished, premiered at a local film festival with no hope for global attention. But the audience gave it a standing ovation. Not because it dazzled but because it told the truth softly. And in the middle of that ocean of standing bodies, Tom Skerritt did what only he could do. He stayed seated. Smiled. And nodded, like a man who had said what he came to say. But there is still light beyond this point, still the last turn of the pen, the final note in the symphony. Because what Tom left behind wasn't a trail of glory or scandal or spectacle. It was a philosophy. A quiet revolution. In a chaotic era where everyone seemed to be speaking faster, louder, with growing desperation to be seen among the digital blur, something curious began to happen in the wake of Tom Skerritt's return to the frame, not just in film, not only on the page, but deep in the cultural current. It wasn't orchestrated, trending, or even named at first. It was more like a ripple, than a wave. One that started with a simple observation. Not all stories shout. And not all lives need to. Skerritt hadn't invented stillness. But somehow, by living it, by choosing it over comfort, popularity, or applause, he gave others permission to seek it, too. Quietly, humbly, a movement began reshaping the narrative so long dominated by velocity and spectacle. Writers started referencing him in essays about creative authenticity. A new generation of screen actors, exhausted by social media pressure and branding expectations, began to recite lines from The Weight of Quiet during interviews, like scripture for the soul. A young filmmaker from Montana famously launched a no-dialogue short film series titled Skerritt, where the entire focus was on atmosphere, nuanced expression, and the unspoken narrative. He said in an interview, "Skerritt gave us the courage to believe that if the silence is honest, people will lean in." Even in classrooms, especially in drama schools that had spent decades churning out charisma and projection, teachers found themselves assigning his scenes as studies in restraint. "Watch what he's not doing," one acting coach instructed. "Notice how that's more profound than what most actors scream to achieve." It was a subtle legacy, quietly powerful, quietly transformative. Tom, meanwhile, kept working, not in volume, but in value. He gave rare interviews with deep purpose, usually one-on-one, to small publications or student-run campus magazines, always prioritizing conversation over clicks. Whether talking about craft, masculinity, or the inevitability of age, he returned again and again to a single idea. We're all trying to matter, but the moment you let go of being impressive, you become unforgettable. His health, too, had begun to decline. Slowly, inevitably. There were days he didn't speak at all. Not out of frailty, but because he enjoyed listening, to birds, to wind, to the evolving rhythm of the land he'd spent so many years in. The silence no longer needed to be chosen. It had moved inside him, become part of his breath, his aging bones, his signature. One afternoon, a visit came, unannounced. A 26-year-old actor from Vancouver, with trembling hands and a paper notebook, knocked on Tom's front door. He had driven 5 hours after finding Skerritt's address through a mutual friend. He didn't expect the man to answer, certainly not to invite him in. But Tom did. He brought him tea. Listened to his story. The boy was scared, desperately talented but drowning in rejection, burnout, and self-doubt. His dream, he admitted, felt like it belonged to someone louder. Tom didn't say much. But when the boy finished, hands fidgeting in shame, almost apologetic for his sensitivity, Tom leaned forward, gently placed his weathered hand on the boy's arm, and said, "It's your dream. Just dream it differently." The silence afterward was sacred. The young man left that day not simply inspired, but seen, in a way that reshaped how he understood success. That one sentence changed the vector of his life, and in the years to come, he would credit Tom Skerritt not for teaching him how to act, but how to live within his own truth. More stories began to emerge. Readers who found themselves in Tom's gentle words and actors who finally understood that presence wasn't about permission, it was about purpose. Poets who recited Scarrett's lines at open mics. Therapists who used his passages to help men talk about vulnerability and the weight of masculinity. Teachers who printed his quotes on their classroom walls. Still, Tom refused to become a symbol. Symbols are bigger than life, and he had never had interest in becoming anything less real than himself. Yet, even in his final years, the moments of impact multiplied like candle flames sparked from a single quiet match. Not a fire that rushes, but one that lingers, illuminating slowly. And then, quietly, just how he would have wanted it, the end arrived. No social media tributes at first. No breaking headlines. Only a single email sent by his family to a carefully chosen list of peers, collaborators, and friends. It read simply. Tom passed this morning in his sleep. At home. Peaceful. Thank you for the years of love. He always said he heard you, even in silence. The world did catch up. Obituaries bloomed like flowers in every major newspaper. Not clickbait, not gossip, but respect. The headlines chose restraint, as if honoring the man required mirroring his tone. Tom Scarrett, a life of quiet grace. The actor who listened. Hollywood's gentle rebel ends his journey. And then something extraordinary happened. Across the country, small theaters dimmed their lights, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Film festivals held impromptu candlelit screenings of his old films. Not the blockbusters, but the quieter ones. The roles he infused with a kind of subtle, aching dignity that few had the patience to understand before. And online, readers began posting passages from The Weight of Quiet, often accompanied by simple photos, rivers, forests, quiet moments with family. One woman posted a picture of her father, a stern man who'd softened only in his final years, and wrote. Tom Scarrett gave me my last good conversation with my dad. We didn't talk much. But we both read Scarrett's book, and afterward, we sat on the porch quietly. It was the best hour of my life. That was his miracle. Not to make people love him, but to help people find love in their own stillness. To remind the loud world that silence is not absence, it's presence, distilled down to its purest form. And even in death, he refused spectacle. There was no state ceremony. No televised funeral. Just friends and family gathered beside the water's edge where he once walked alone for hours at a time. His ashes were scattered into the glinting tide at sunset, washed into the current like another quiet story slipping between the folds of day and night. As the light faded, a child, no older than 7, watched the tide and asked, was he famous? An older man beside her just smiled and replied. No, sweetheart. He was real. And somehow, that felt like the right answer. But the story doesn't end on the waters of Puget Sound. Because the silence Scarrett left behind didn't echo, it planted. And in the final part of his story, we'll explore what grew in its place. Years after Tom Scarrett's voice quieted and his footsteps faded down the moss-lined trails of the Pacific Northwest, the world didn't forget him, not because he insisted on being remembered, but because his absence asked something uncommon of us, to be still, and to listen. And in that stillness, something bloomed. In a quiet art center a few miles outside of Seattle, a bronze plaque was fastened to the wall one spring morning. Simple. Understated. Much like the man it honored. It read. Dedicated to Tom Scarrett, who proved that listening is an art, silence is a language, and truth does not require applause. Below it sat a bench facing the sound where he used to walk. It wasn't meant to be a monument for tourists, no tours were given, no brochures printed. But people came all the same. Not in hordes, not with fanfare, but gently. Softly. The same way you'd whisper into a church where someone was still praying. One woman, a playwright struggling with her second act, came and sat there with tears in her eyes. "Your silence," she whispered, "gave my voice room to come out." A young actor who couldn't afford rent back in LA came, too, with a dog-eared copy of The Weight of Quiet pressed to his chest like a script that held his salvation. He left a note tucked under the plaque. It read, "I finally understand that I don't have to set myself on fire just to be seen. Thank you." These were not the dramatic gestures of celebrity legacy. They were far more enduring. These were roots taking hold. Quiet things growing in dark, rich soil. The kind of growth that doesn't trend, but lasts. Years passed. Generations shifted. But Scarrett's name, strangely, beautifully, deepened. In theater circles, his performances became case studies in emotional architecture. Professors taught classes titled The Power of Restraint, and Scarrett's face was etched onto the syllabus beside actors like Philip Seymour Hoffman and Frances McDormand, those who didn't perform to be seen, but to reveal. In literature circles, his book slowly became a cult artifact. Not a bestseller, but a lifesaver. Often recommended in hushed tones, between therapists, struggling fathers, burned-out teachers, newly retiring veterans who hadn't yet found how to transition from noise to peace. And then, something even more curious happened. A quiet revolution that bore his fingerprints began to swell, not in Hollywood or New York or Cannes, but in the places ignored by the machinery of spectacle. It began in Plattsburgh, New York, where a film school opened a scholarship in his name, for students who someday might choose a smaller spotlight in favor of a bigger truth. Then came a rural writing retreat in British Columbia by the same name. Then a Montana Veterans Arts Helpline built around his philosophies: share when you're ready, in your way. Silence is not cowardice. Silence is sacred. What Tom had left behind wasn't limited to story, screen, or song. He had given people back permission to be gentle in a world trained to roar. And somehow, without intending it, he'd altered the definition of strength, not by argument or activism, but by example. To be kind without audience. To be present without claiming space. To create without craving credit. To live like a poem read only once, but remembered forever. One day, many years after his passing, a filmmaker, his grandnephew, though he'd never met Tom, premiered a small, intimate documentary titled, The Man Who Chose Silence. The credits rolled to the soft trickle of wind through trees, no spoken words, just black and white footage of Scarrett preparing a fishing line, laughing at home in old video footage, and finally, that unforgettable moment captured at the edge of the stage under the maples, from so many years ago. It didn't win awards. But it inspired honesty. That's the rare currency Scarrett traded in, not glamour but groundedness. Not fame, but truth wrapped in silence. And if you ask those who'd felt the echo of his presence now, years beyond his life, how to define legacy, they might say this. Legacy is not what survives us when we're gone. It's what softens the world while we're still here, and makes it a little quieter after. Tom Scarrett did not just choose silence over spotlight. He chose integrity over image, craft over celebrity, and soul over spectacle. He spent a lifetime walking beside the noise without ever being consumed by it, and in doing so, planted something too deep to be washed away. So the next time a laugh rings quieter, a pause lingers longer, or someone chooses listening instead of leaping to speak, we might unknowingly feel him. Not in volume, but in presence. In the weight of quiet. In the breath between lines. In the kind of silence that reminds us, something real is happening here. And that, perhaps, is the greatest kind of legacy, a life not remembered by how many saw it, but by how deeply it touched those who did.